CFL 110, your weekly trip around the biggest stories in the Canadian Football League with Jeff Hamilton and Andrew Hustler Paterson. Presented by Garage Living Winnipeg.
What's going on, CFL fans, and welcome to another edition of CFL 110 here on the Winnipeg Sports Talk YouTube channel and podcast. If you're finding us on YouTube and you want the audio version in your podcast feed, just search CFL 110 wherever you get your favorite podcasts. And if you're out of the market, feel free to check out Winnipeg Sports Talk on a daily basis as well, going live at 1 p.m. Central. Andrew Paterson, along with Jeff Hamilton of the Winnipeg Free Press. And we've got a lot to talk about in the CFL. 3 winless teams remain, including the defending Western Conference champion Winnipeg Blue Bombers. And the Montreal Alouettes still on top of the league, and some big stories around the 3-down game, which we're going to get to over the course of this next little while. Just before we bring in Jeff and get the show on the road, CFL 110 is brought to you by our friends at Garage Living Winnipeg. Folks, is your garage a mess? Do you have a tough time opening your car door because of all the clutter, or wish you had more room to work on the projects, or kick it with the fellas on the block in the garage? Garage Living Winnipeg can take care of all of that, and in just a few days, you can have a beautiful, clean, functional garage that looks amazing and adds value to your home. Garage Living Winnipeg specializes in stunning polyaspartic floor coatings, high-end, made-in-Canada metal cabinets, slat wall, and overhead storage solutions. Call our pal Pat Kanuga for a free in-garage consultation at 204-999-1234. Pat has been a vintage car guy for decades. He knows garages and spends a lot of time in them. And whether it's a 10-car garage mahal or a single-car garage in the back lane, Pat and Garage Living can come up with designs to meet your needs. Give them a call in the Winnipeg and Manitoba area, 204-999-1234. You can find out more online at garageliving.com. Garage Living Winnipeg, garages made for living. Let's welcome in the hammer to the program. Jeff, what's going on? You made it back from Cowtown, okay?
Yeah, Haas, I was there for the Bombers and Stamps thriller over the weekend. And as I was saying to you off mic, as you can hear probably in my voice, maybe even see it in my face as this bright light, maybe blossom some of that sweat on my face. But I came home with more than the meat sweats from 3 days of barbecue. I've also got a bit of a head cold, but I think that just makes me a little bit more prickly than usual, which I don't know is a bad thing, maybe to some people. But looking forward to another great episode, man. Still lots to talk about here in the 3-down loop over what was a pretty cool week 4.
Yes, I am still living in a former CFL city, Las Vegas, Nevada. Shout out to the posse. Thanks to this WestJet schmozzle, I, instead of leaving on Sunday, am leaving on Wednesday now. So glad we're able to get this out and get this ready, because we've got a big weekend of games coming up and a lot to talk about coming out of last week. And listen, we'll get to the Bombers and some of the winless teams in a minute. It has been a really nice start with the Saskatchewan Roughriders. They come off the bye week back into action this week. But the big story for the green and white right now is the Trevor Harris injury. And you said in this program you were dubious about the potential of Harris returning to the game when he was injured a couple weeks ago. We now know that you were onto something there. He's on the 6-game list. It's Shea Paterson time in Saskatchewan right now. And with all due respect to Shea Paterson, we'll see what he can do. It's a big blow for the Riders after such a great start, coming off of a 7-game losing streak to end their past 2 regular seasons.
Yeah, I mean, after their week 3 win, over Hamilton, obviously, Harris got injured right before halftime and made his triumphant return to the sideline wearing a big brace on his left knee. And post game, Corey Mace talked about how he was in his ear saying, "I'm ready to go. I'm ready to go." I mean, no coach in their right mind would put their franchise quarterback back in a game that they still had control over. Especially after seeing the way Trevor Harris went down. And that's what really kind of did it for me, was just, the look in his face. And I'm not trying to be a horse whisperer here by going just off body language or whatnot, but he just felt defeated. And then I had heard some rumblings over the weekend. I actually had heard I first heard it was more serious than it was being portrayed. And then I heard there was a tear. So to find out, that Trevor Harris suffered what the club's calling a moderate sprain, and has been added to the 6-game injured list, and there's still talk that he, may get pulled off early. I just, in that moment, that whole, wanted to go in, all that kind of warrior stuff, to me, that felt more like not introducing negative news into the bye week for a number of reasons. You don't want your players to kind of feel down from that news. You don't want the media talking about it, digging, trying to figure out what exactly is wrong with Trevor Harris. So I think that was, a bit of gamesmanship, if you will. But, to see Trevor Harris not come out for practice this week, I understand it's, like I said, his left knee. It was his right leg that he fractured, last season that ended his year. So, we'll see what happens here, but just not great news. And, as you mentioned, if, looks like the Riders will be rolling with Shea Paterson for the foreseeable future, a guy who, finished 4 for 10 for 41 yards in relief in that second half. Didn't exactly muster a ton of confidence, I think, to anyone that was watching. But we'll see how long Trevor Harris is out, because it's the Shea Paterson show, and he beat out Mason Fine for that number 2 job. Now he gets to show his stuff earlier than expected.
Yeah, huge opportunity for Paterson. I understand how concerning this could be for Rider Nation, considering what happened to their season after Trevor Harris went down. And so far, with the exception of this, which is a major exception because losing your starting quarterback, it can deep six an entire year, it really has been a nice start for the team. And I will say this, not that Shea Paterson had to go out and win the game for the Riders. They were in a pretty good position when he went out. But the fact they were able to hold on, win that football game against Hamilton, the confidence that he got from winning the number 2 job in the preseason, I think bodes. There should be some optimism that they've got a guy, but the bottom line is the optimism really will return to Saskatchewan when they know that Trevor Harris will be returning to the lineup, because he looked really good so far in this year, and you can't win without quality quarterbacking. They know they have it in Trevor Harris. A bit of a question mark over the youngster Paterson.
And they're in a much better situation than they have been in years under Corey Mace, who's revamped the culture with that team in quick order and has got his special teams and his defense playing, top-end football. I mean, when you look at that game, there was never really a fear, despite playing against the Bo Levi Mitchell and Hamilton Ticats that looked okay through the first 2 weeks, although they ended up, losing both games. The defense took over. I mean, they got within the red zone, forced a fumble. There was a pick 6, but that ultimately iced the game. It was the defense picked up the slack. That's an effort that, when you have the other phases going, you just need to get some production from your offense. And when you look at AJ Ouellette and him coming to life in week 3, the running game's finally there. I don't think the Riders are in as bad a shape as most teams would be, including those Winnipeg Blue Bombers, who are also looking at their health of their quarterback and wondering if he'll be available this week.
So while the Riders return to action in a tough game at home as a home dog with their backup quarterback against the Argos, the Winnipeg Blue Bombers come back after another tight but eventual loss at 0-4. And while Trevor Harris was knocked out 2 weeks ago, concern was cranked up even more than it already was in Bomberland when Zach Caleros left the game and did not return. And Jeff, coming out of practice today, no Zach Caleros again. It seems like the Bombers, who have been living a charmed life for the last 4 seasons, are getting a few years worth of adversity in the first year of 2024.
Yeah, it's gone from bad to worse for the Blue and Gold. Obviously, an 0-4 start isn't as surprising after watching their first 3 games, but nobody would have pictured or envisioned this heading into the year. Zach Caleros, took a hard hit to the midsection. He was down and out. Looked like, just from, I'll play doctor from my binoculars from way up in the press box, but even when you saw him, focused on TV, he looked like a guy who had lost his wind, right? His hands were above his head. He wasn't reaching for anything. It wasn't like a knee or any kind of, again, wasn't reaching for any limb. It looked like he had just got absolutely hit hard in the midsection. Now, obviously, there's other concerns when you get hit in the midsection, including, your ribs, your spleen, just, other things that are in and around that spot. I guess it was promising to a certain degree that Zach came in for 2 more plays after that hit. Like, it looked like he had to be out because it called for the medical staff to come on and pause the game. He had a mandatory 3 plays to be out. And when I watched him on the sideline during that stretch, he looked eager to get back into the game. And so, for him to come back and go through 2 plays, one of which was a passing attempt, good sign in the sense that it wasn't immediate. He wasn't thinking, oh my goodness, I got ribs dislocated, because anyone who's ever had any kind of injury to their ribs, they know right away, and it kills. But then obviously at halftime was ruled out, or was actually called questionable. Huss, he wasn't actually technically ruled out of the game. Now he wouldn't return in a losing effort, so clearly he wasn't available. But from what I understand, what I was told, was that the issue was he had some issues breathing at halftime. Like, his full lung capacity wasn't necessarily there. So that was the reason, for precautionary reasons. Is there a concern that Zach Collaros isn't out for day 1 of practice? It's not a great sign, but it's not the end of the world. This could be about gamesmanship as well. I mean, just to show the fact that he might not be playing, but then again, he could be right back on the field by tomorrow. He's not a guy, in my opinion, that can just take the week off, show up behind center, and get ready to go. And I don't think the Bombers would be, as dumb to do that. But I do expect him to return. I don't expect it to be long-term by any stretch. I sent him a couple texts over the weekend. He seemed to be okay. So we'll see what happens at the end of that. But certainly a scary scene when you're already dealing with your 2 top receivers in Dalton Schoen and Kenny Lawler out. And it's been well documented just how many injuries. Maybe the names aren't bigger, but the quantity on defense, particularly the defensive line, has just been obliterated by this team. And the fact that the defense keeps kind of hanging in there and giving the Bombers a chance to win is a positive, but it's been mostly negatives here for the Blue and Gold.
Listen, I watched that game here in Sin City, and I was really impressed with the performance of the Bomber defense. I mean, they did everything they could to help keep that team in the football game and give them a chance to win. And as we've been saying really all year long, which is exactly the opposite of what we expect that we could count on, it's been the Winnipeg offense that just has not been clicking. Now, Collaros hasn't been at an MOP level. I don't think there's anyone that will debate that. But you combine the game 1 injury to Kenny Lawler and now the season-ending injury to Dalton Schoen. It's about $500,000 worth of receivers right now, Jeff. A huge part of the Winnipeg salary cap put towards guys that are out right now. And now you're relying on a running game that just hasn't clicked under the changes in the offensive line right now, with Brady Oliveira off to a relatively pedestrian start. Nick Dembski and Drew Wolodarski being essentially the only familiar targets, and a bunch of other guys that are getting rushed into roles maybe earlier than they were ready and relied on to make big plays. And that's resulted in an 0-4 start. But for all the concerns of the defense, that's not the reason why the Bombers are 0-4 right now. And, Chris Streveler is such an interesting individual in that he has the ability to just bulldoze individuals for 2 or 3 yards. He's an incredible competitor. But much like we saw in 2019 when they traded for Zach Collaros, when he is the guy, the danger of him lighting you up for big plays in the passing game just isn't quite there with a lot of other quarterbacks. To his credit, with the game on the line, much like he did back in the NFL preseason, came through and got the job done to get the game to overtime. But the Bombers currently constructed right now have very, very little room for error, and throwing a pick in the end zone in overtime and giving Calgary the opportunity to basically run a couple plays and kick a field goal has the team at 0-4 right now. And if Collaros can't go, what a wild quarterback matchup we'll have at Princess Auto Stadium this week, from Collaros' understudy going in Drew Brown going up against Collaros, or going up against Chris Streveler in a game that the Bombers are the real desperate team going in after Ottawa had a big win against the Ticats last week.
Yeah, I think you nailed it right on the head there, Huss, with just the margin for error. It's so significantly lower this year than in previous seasons. They were able to make up for errors, whereas when they make mistakes like we saw this past week against Calgary, like we saw before that against BC and Ottawa and Montreal. I mean, go look at the final quarter. Even though, credit to Chris Streveler, who eventually found his game. If I'm the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, I'm just telling that guy I'm only bringing him in for the fourth quarter, because that's when his magic appears, whether it's the NFL preseason or the CFL, as we witnessed over the weekend. He just gets the job done. You can even make the argument, Huss, that Chris Streveler ran the offense better than Zach Collaros did in that game, even though he wasn't great at all and missed a couple of targets in the third quarter. He at least spread the ball around. I mean, it's one thing to say who you got, right, and credit your scouting department and bringing in players. I mean, we've heard from Mike O'Shea over and over and over again this season, the talent in which they brought in at receiver, and the guys like Josh Johnson, Ontario Wilson, and yet those guys weren't even looked at by Zach Collaros in the first half. And it wasn't until the second half that Streveler tried, kind of open things up and found those guys, that they finally made some plays. Like Wilson made an incredible play in overtime, dodging a receiver for a 19-yard gain and really setting them up before Streveler ended up hitting, of course, going back to one of his big targets in Nick Dembski and getting picked off by a former Blue Bomber in Demario Houston, which was pretty much the icing on the cake for this team. But the margin error is just not there, and this team, whether it's the moving pieces on the O-line, whether it's struggles trying to establish the running game under what's been an injured Brady Oliveira for much of the season, whether it's trying to figure out pressure on from defense, even though the defense is doing well. One of the biggest issues right now is the lack of turnovers. So getting 2 turnovers against Calgary, matching their season total through the first 3 games, is a promising sign. But I asked that question. I've asked that to colleagues and other people. Asked to you. I don't think the game is nearly as close if Jake Maier doesn't go back to last year's Jake Maier, where he was couldn't hit the broadside of a barn. I mean, this guy was averaging 80% of his passing in the first 2 games, comes off the bye week and doesn't look anything like he did in the first 2 weeks. So the Bombers definitely benefited from that. But yeah, it's uphill sledding right now for Winnipeg, and they got to get this thing figured out. You're reading in Ottawa right now about how the Red Blacks have the opportunity to get back in the East, to playing the Blue Bombers here. I mean, how different is that? This is the Bombers' opportunity to look at Ottawa Red Blacks team that has played okay football, has found themselves winning more often than not at 2-1, but is certainly a beatable team, both last week and again against the Bombers in week 2.
Well, and it gets back to that small margin for victory and for error. I mean, the Red Blacks could easily be 0-3. They're not. They're 2-1. And I mean, you look at the last 3 games, all very, very close games for the Bombers. None of that matters when they're 0-4. Moving on to another 0-4 team with very little room for error is the Hamilton Tiger Cats. And they were playing a team that they have owned for the last 5 seasons in Ottawa. And listen, the CFL is full of wild special teams plays. We're going to get to one in a minute. But it was a special teams play that in a lot of ways created the downfall for Hamilton. And it's the difference between them having a knock in the win column or sitting with the Elks and the Bombers winless on the season.
Yeah, I mean, and we'll get into it, but it's just been bad play calling that's done them in a couple different times this year already in the season. And in this case, you have Bo Levi Mitchell, who went back to the old Bo Levi Mitchell this game. He eclipsed 300 passing yards. He was moving the ball downfield. He hits Shamar Bridges to go up by 2 points. They can't get the 2-point convert to make it 3, so they're stuck at 1 or go up by 1 point. And then with whatever 28 seconds or whatever it was left to squiggle kick it to not. I mean, they were obviously not wanting to hit it to Devontae Dedmon, which I understand, but it backfired in them majorly. And so this squibble kick was returned 27 yards into good field position, and then 3 plays and 19 yards later, Lewis Ward is lining up a game-winning 46-yarder. Now, there was some interesting parts to this. Not, one play doesn't dictate everything, but one play that at the end of the game that leads to that is one thing. Last week it was against, or 2 weeks ago it was against, or whatever it was, against Saskatchewan, it was kicking the ball back, doing an onside kick with 6 minutes remaining in the fourth quarter. I said on this program, it was like, what's Scott Milanovic doing? Does he forget that he's in the CFL? Like, has he been in the NFL far too long to remember that 3 minutes is an eternity in the CFL, let alone, twice as much of that? And I mean, that tells to me just a lack of trust for his defense. His offense wasn't moving that game, but in this one in particular, like, he just didn't trust your special teams. You didn't think they'd make a play. And now Dedmon was pretty dangerous in that game. He did give up the first one. He fumbled the opening kickoff, but was incredibly dangerous. I think he averaged he had 162 return yards on 8 returns. So the guy was cooking. So I understand not wanting to give it to him, but when you end up hitting to another guy, he ends up getting 27 yards on that play. A couple plays later, you're in field goal range, because the other thing too, Huss, is Drew Brown's throwing on 3rd and 1 in that situation with 6 seconds remaining, because Lewis Ward can't hit a 56-yarder. Now, we saw a 60-yarder from Sergio Castillo, so it can happen this past week, but they couldn't hit. He's not really known for his big hits, his big
very
kicks.
Accurate, so just doesn't have
that leg. So great play by Drew Brown in that final play. Get the 10 yards, move it to a 46. So things had to happen. It wasn't like this squibble kick, led to them, just obliterating or exploding here. Things had to happen, but it was just another decision, and it ultimately led to Paul Boudreau getting fired this afternoon. So scapegoat, absolutely.
Didn't last very long, but I mean, when you look at 2 losses that can be squarely pegged on 2 very questionable decisions on special teams, head coaches at times will make those decisions. Well, from one special teams play, I guess we can technically call this a special teams play.
Technically.
The Alouettes are at it again, successfully getting a first down on the dribble kick. Certainly the most polarizing and controversial play in current Canadian Football League discussions.
And let them get mad. Let them stay mad, Huss. I think this, to me, I mean, just to recap it, facing a 2nd and 20 on their own 45, Fajardo rolls out, screen pass to Jesseron Antwi, the usual suspect who's already had one go his way. I think the other one was Speaker, maybe. I know it wasn't all Antwi, but I know Antwi has a successful dribble kick last season, and they were done in the same month. I think it was both in October last year. Anyways, ends up getting the ball in the flat. The closest player to him is 13 yards away, and he gets to the line and he toe taps the ball over the line, picks it up, and for anyone who doesn't know what we're talking about, it resets the down. So it goes from 2nd and 20, this dribble punt over the line of scrimmage. You got to be behind this line of scrimmage. Goes 2 yards, guy drops on it. It's a 1st and 10, and once again, Montreal becomes the talk of the league for what, as you said, Haas, it's just so polarizing. Like and it was split down the middle during the offseason. This was a big, conversation at the winter meetings, was whether or not teams wanted this to be in the rule book. They took a serious look at this after the Alouettes tried to do it twice. And I just want to say one thing. They're not the first ones who have tried it. They're the first ones who have actually succeeded in executing it. Because Brad Sinopoli and the Ottawa Red Blacks years ago, this was even years before this, he tried to do it and it failed. And so it's just, and when I asked Mike O'Shea about it before, the special teams guru in the CFL, he knew exactly what the rule was. He knew exactly that what his team was capable of doing. He just didn't have anybody, I think, that he trusted to pull it off. So in that breath, and when I asked about the coaches and GMs over the winter meetings, I was kind of surprised to see it split down the middle. A lot of people loved it, and it didn't go by passports. Some of the Americans wanted it in. Some of the Canadian coaches and GMs didn't. Ultimately, it remained in. I think you want to keep those kind of outside of the box rules to differentiate yourself from leagues like the NFL. I mean, people will think it's wacky. I see it on social media. They think it's absolutely ridiculous and get borderline angry or full on raged over it. But I think it's just a unique, quirky thing. And if you're not going to get ready for it, get ready to get burned. What do you think, Huss?
Yeah, well, listen, I mean, I'm in for some of the quirky things of the Canadian Football League. I will say it is I mean, it's the cheesiest play in football. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But I think I kind of just give credit where credit is due to Montreal to identify this, that, on 2nd and 20, the percentage chance of completing that 20-yard play and maintaining possession of the football is relatively low. And if you practice something well and are able to execute that, like traditionally CFL defenses are going to give you all the room you want in that first 10 yards on 2nd and really long. And if you can turn that into a first down and keep the football, you're better off for it. So the Alouettes have been innovative enough to have that club in their bag and use it when they've needed it. And the onus is going to be on defenses. And what is interesting on this, and this plays into Montreal's favor, and part of the reason why they're the number 1 team in the league right now, the fact that they have done it again, every single team that's going to be playing Montreal is going to be prepared for this. They'll be paying attention to it a little bit more. They'll be moving their defense up to try to prevent that. And guess what? They're going to have probably some more looks on 2nd 20s when they're actually throwing the ball, trying to get a first down as well. So I don't have an issue with it. I understand there are a lot of people that think it's a bit of a joke and it makes the Canadian Football League look not particularly good. I don't go that far on it. If they want to change the rule, do it. Otherwise, credit to the Montreal Alouettes for finding, if you will, a bit of a loophole and finding a way to keep on, not only keep the football, but keep on winning the way they have. Another team that hasn't been winning, in addition to the Bombers and the Ticats, is the Edmonton Elks. I have taken them with our picks for Cool Bet every week. I always say good teams win, great teams cover. And the Elks are great at covering the spread. They're not so good at actually winning football games. And MBT thinks they're cursed.
Well, he thinks that there's football ancestors out there that challenge teams for a reason, and he believes that they're challenging them for a reason. I mean, you can look at their record. You can look at the fact that they went into that game losing their first 3 games by a total of 14 points. So to lose another walk-off in the way that they did is a tough pill to swallow. And you have to start looking at yourself and wondering what it is that we're doing. But it's that Zach attitude of not looking internally and not seeing the penalties and not seeing some of the other, glaring errors on this club, including a defense that, hasn't been playing well under Jason Shivers. And
I thought it was because they changed their name. That's what I hear all the time. That's why they're cursed.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, that's probably the curse.
Name.
Whoever, those old names, the people who control the names. I don't even know where I'm going with that, but certainly they're haunting the Elks. I think it's much like what's going on in Winnipeg, to be quite frank. It's that they don't have a margin for error. And the crazy thing is they often shoot themselves in the foot when it comes to discipline and penalties. Did you not see Chris Jones absolutely berating one of his special teams players on the sideline? It has hit an absolute boil in Edmonton because no matter how hard or long you yell and reinforce, execution and discipline, it just doesn't seem to get through to this group that seems to be taking the penalties at the worst possible times ever. And so, a lot of this certainly is, a little bit of bad luck, but, we'll go back to that old saying, Huss, you create your own luck. And while you see teams like Montreal and Saskatchewan dictating, the way that they perform and the outcomes they get, you don't see the same from the teams in the bottom that ultimately are, pointing to other things as issues. Now, I don't think that, the Bombers are saying we're injured, that's why we're not playing well, or that the Elks are necessarily saying we're cursed, that's not why we're playing well. That these are two teams that are showing up week in and week out, going hard and hoping for better results. They're just not getting them. And at this point, whether it's talent, whether it's circumstance, whether it's the football gods way above us, Haas, it really doesn't matter. You need to win. So if you need to start looking towards south of the equator, look down towards, hell to get you out of this one, then maybe that's what you need to do, because these teams are burning and burning quickly. And, they're getting separated. That's the reality of it. The teams in the West, there's no real juggernauts in the entire league outside of Montreal, but you still need to make up those points, and the games certainly do not get easier as the season goes on.
Yeah, and one other note on the Elks too. They have foregone their first-round selection in next year's CFL draft to pick up a beast of a receiver out of NDSU, Zach Mathis, 6'7", joining the club. So just an interesting note, the supplemental draft, the Elks were the bottom. If they
Another guy who found a parent who was born in Canada. Another guy who found out over the weekend he was Canadian. Nice.
Funny how things work. Anyways, the Elks looking to turn it around. Bombers, Ticats, Elks, all winless through June, needing to turn this thing around. And I mean, overall in the West, we started off talking about the Harris injury. If he is out long term, it doesn't necessarily doom Saskatchewan's season, especially with the start that they've had and what's happening with Edmonton and with Winnipeg. Far from it. But it does make, I think, the BC Lions clearly the team to beat right now in the Western Division. But I think Calgary's 2-2 right now. They could easily be 0-4. And we're seeing that about. There's a real middle right now. But the bottom line, Jeff, for years, the West has been by far the most powerful division. You could make an argument right now that it's not close. I mean, Montreal and Toronto could be the top two teams. Toronto's already beaten BC this year. And you've got a very middling Calgary team holding down third spot, and Edmonton and Winnipeg, who might feel that they deserve a better fate, at 0-4 right now. We have not seen a Western division in the CFL looking like this at this point in the season in a long time.
Absolutely. I mean, you can look at last year, right? You can look at 2023, but because the Blue Bombers and the BC Lions were viewed as one or two of the best, obviously the Argos were 16-2, but they were viewed as kind of the most dangerous teams in the league, obviously with Toronto. And then after Toronto, it was just, you had the Montreal Alouettes who hadn't won a single game all season against Toronto, BC, and Winnipeg, the three juggernauts, right? But the West has kind of been on a little bit of a decline, and it continues to fall. You had the 4-14, Elks last year. You had the 6-12 Roughriders and Stampeders. One of them had to make the playoffs, apparently. So there is kind of that openness, but it really is like the bottom's falling out on both sides, and it's creating an environment where an 0-4 start, whether you're the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, Hamilton Tiger Cats, or Edmonton Elks, you have time. I mean, we were talking about this late in the year last year about how the Elks, if they just go on like a little, at the same time we were talking about this historic home losing streak, on the other side of our mouths, we were talking about how the Elks weren't out of it, and if they could, turn something on around week 15, week 16, it could be a whole different season. So even though we have, a handful of 0-4 teams here, and the West is kind of bottoming out, I think it's created a weirdly competitive environment moving forward because there's nobody who's, necessarily separating themselves from the pack. I see, we've talked about this for a few weeks now. BC narrowly lost last week, right, to Edmonton. So, they only beat the Blue Bombers by 2 points. They lost to the Argos this year. You look at, you mentioned Saskatchewan not having Harris. How are they going to pan out here for the next however long they need to get things done? Can Winnipeg, if they have to go through a Collaros injury, what are they going to look like? The Stampeders did not look like world beaters against Winnipeg and look like a very beatable team. And then switching over to the East, same story, right? Like it's Hamilton's 0-4. Ottawa may be good, may not be good. Same story with Toronto. It was Cameron Dukes exposed in that game against Montreal. I still think they're a good team. So there's just a lot of room to move here. And while there's some fan bases, I'm sure, looking at their records and, slamming their fists on the table or are concerned about the future, the reality is there's a very long season ahead of them. And I see opportunities for all four of those teams at 0-4, let alone the teams that are riding high right now at the top of their division.
Oh, there's no doubt about it, which is a nice little segue into Week 5 in the Canadian Football League. We've talked a lot about the Riders and this injury to Trevor Harris. Shea Paterson and the Riders, 3-point underdogs at home to Dukes and the Argos on the old Cool Bet lines. But I'll tell you what, this game Friday night in the Peg at Princess Auto Stadium, if you had told me that in Week 5 we'd be talking about a game for the Bombers against Ottawa that has major potential playoff implications that say you're nuts, but that's where we are right now. Think about this, Jeff. The Bombers are 0-4. You have to think that there's a chance that they can pull it back in and get into third position in the West. But if you even want to think about keeping the possibility for a crossover alive, knowing that Montreal and Toronto were clearly, I think, the two best teams in the East, a win would get you to 1-4 and bring Ottawa back to 2-2. A loss would have the Bombers at 0-5. The Red Blacks at 3-1 with 2 wins head-to-head against the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. Like, I know we've said, hey, it's early, we'll see what happens. Winnipeg needs a win right now, and this game actually has a lot more importance than I think anyone could have imagined a month ago.
Big time. For the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, I can tell you right now at 0-4, this season certainly does not start after Labor Day. It starts immediately. And they need to get things going against a team that they can beat Ottawa. Ottawa's, even with the injuries, Ottawa is not a team that that the Bombers should be worried about. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be easy for them. They also, the Ottawa Red Blacks showed some major resilience last week, and they've shown that Drew Brown will go down swinging. Like, he'll never be a guy who gives up on any play, no matter where it is in the game. So it's not like it's going to be an easy one, but even the idea, Huss, that you need to win against teams against the West, which is obviously incredibly important when it comes to, jockeying for yourself in standings. But the way the Bombers are, the East matters just as much, because this team could very well be looking at a crossover, by the end of the season. So and it's not a time to be scoreboard watching, but if you look at the matchups this week, you do have the Calgary Stampeders with a very tough matchup going into Montreal this week. The Bombers are going to hope for a loss there, because you need to start making up this ground. As I mentioned in the last 10 minutes ago or so, it's you need to get these wins. You need to get all these points. You need to these games matter just as much as they will down the line here, and the Bombers can't afford to be dropping games that are led to teams that are led by their backup quarterback.
Teams like the Winnipeg Blue Bombers need to win games right now to give themselves an opportunity to have meaningful games on the stretch. I mean, 4 losses is 4 losses, and when you have nothing in the win column, it really does create that sense of urgency. Coolbet lines from our friends over at Coolbet Canada. Riders, 3-point home underdogs to the Argos. The Bombers right now are 2.5-point favorites at home against Ottawa. Pay attention to that line and the status of Zach Caleros as how that might move. The Alouettes, no surprise, huge favorites at home to Calgary. 9.5 points after their 10-point win over the Argos last week in a battle of undefeateds. And the BC Lions hit the road looking to keep the Ticats winless at 0-5 if they lose this game. BC, a 6-point favorite in the Sunday game. We're only in week 5 right now. The Elks will not win a game this week because they are on the bye. Hamilton's got a real tough opponent in BC. This is a great opportunity for Winnipeg to at least get on the board and get one up on Edmonton and Hamilton. But honestly, a team like Winnipeg, and frankly, either Edmonton or Hamilton, they're not worried about staying out of 9th in the league. They got to get back in and get within distance of the rest of the teams that are holding down playoff spots right now, so you can get to Labor Day and start playing some meaningful games to solidify playoff position. Wild first month of the Canadian Football League season, Jeff, and here's to a great kickoff for July in week 5.
Certainly an unpredictable one, man. I mean, the one thing you'll get every week, whether, if you're a CFL fan or if you check in, every once in a while, you'll get exciting games, man. That's always the case, regardless of what's happening.
Think about last week. I mean, the game of the week was the Montreal-Toronto game. As we mentioned, Montreal went in Toronto and won that game by 10. Every other game was an absolute thriller.
Yep.
I mean, the BC Lions winning on a late field goal against Edmonton, an overtime walk-off for Calgary, and a walk-off for Ottawa. I mean, the people that are paying the TV bills are loving it because the games have been exciting. The league's liking it, and I'll tell you what, I think it might be, as much as people in Winnipeg not too pleased with the start of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, having a team that's been so dominant for 4 years, start off the way like this, really makes it feel like it is anybody's season right now. And I'm sort of with that. Although I'll say this, it's the Montreal Alouettes, the defending Grey Cup champs, and then everybody else after they dispatched with the Toronto Argonauts. Gang, make sure to check out Jeff's weekly Around the CFL column in the Winnipeg Free Press. And again, a big thanks to our wonderful sponsors at Garage Living Winnipeg. If you'd like more information on how you can revolutionize and transform your garage into a place where it's more organized, you can work and play and increase the value of your home, give Pat Kanuga a call, 204-999-1234. You can find out more online at garageliving.com. Hammer, I will see you back in the peg in time for Friday's game if I ever make it back from Vegas. Great talking to you as always. And here's to another fun week for CFL football fans, beginning Thursday, going right through till Sunday.
Best of luck getting back, man. I know Vegas is a fun city to be in, but it's not a fun city to stay over at. And so I wish you well back and hopefully sooner than later, man. Thanks again. Let's do it all again next week.
It's been a long run. Again, thanks to Garage Living Winnipeg. Big shout out to producer Michael Remus for making this happen. If you're finding us on YouTube, hit that thumbs up. Give a comment on what you think about the start of the season for your favorite team. And make sure to subscribe to the audio version of the podcast wherever you get your favorite pods. Just search CFL 110. For Jeff Hamilton, I'm Andrew Paterson. Enjoy the games this weekend, and we'll see you next week right here on CFL 110.
You've been listening to CFL 110. Tune in next week for more great Canadian football discussion.